Hello, my name is Irum Ahsan, and I work as advisor to the Office of the Compliance Review Panel in Asian Development Bank. Thank you very much, World Justice Project, for inviting me to have this conversation today. I completely appreciate the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Before I start my real conversation, I just want to say that I stand for climate justice, and I also believe in equal treatment, respect, and dignity of all sexes. Oops, now having that off my chest, let me come to the topic of today's conversation, which is why rule of law is important for the development work done by multilateral development banks like the Asian Development Bank. I will divide my conversation into three parts, the why, the how, and the what. So why does Asian Development Bank talk about rule of law? In its strategy 2030, ADB calls for strengthening of governance and institutions, in particular the rule of law, for not only sustaining the benefit of its development work, but also to ensure that these benefits are widely and equitably shared. So now the second part is, how do we translate this big picture strategy into operations? The how part of my conversation, let me give an example of the law and policy reform work that I have been doing in the bank for many years now. The central premise of ADB's law and policy reform program is that a functioning legal system that is anchored on the rule of law and that establishes and implements laws and regulations fairly, consistently, ethically, is essential component of sustainable economic development. So that is how we operationalize the strategy into our work. Now, the third part of my conversation is what do we do to operationalize this the strategy concept of rule of law? Again, I will give you an example of my own work with the bank. So I decided to walk the talk, and I did the deep dive to see which area requires work in which rule of law is the weakest. And no surprises, it was gender equality. And we decided to work in a few countries, including Pakistan, because it was quite low on the gender equality index worldwide. So we realized that in that country, after the needs assessment, that of course patriarchal mindset is the main culprit. But we wanted to work in access to justice and due process of law for women, and we chose justice sector and the prosecutor services, because these two services provide legal background and service to women in the country, or the vulnerable people in the country. So firstly, we trained hundreds of prosecutors and judges on gender-based violence cases and concept of gender-based violence, gender sensitization, how to use gender lens, etc. We then established the first gender-based violence case court in one district of Pakistan, through specialized infrastructure and processes. For example, in terms of infrastructure, we kind of put a screen in front of the witness box so that women and children and other victims of gender-based crimes can stand or sit behind that screen, and so they don't have to face their perpetrator again in the court. Also, e-evidence facilities and many other facilities, infrastructure related in this GBV court. And then we also provided them with court procedures, guidelines, and evidence recording help and assistance based on national laws as well as international best practices. Surprisingly, within 1 year, what we saw that through just this one single GBV court, managed to increase the conviction rate in rape cases from the previous 2% to 20%. Now, seeing this impact, the Chief Justice of Pakistan invited us to help them replicate this GBV court in all districts of Pakistan, which are many more than 100. So this was a huge success, and I think a very interesting example of how we ensure that our work is anchored on rule of law. And then also we had to ADP just goes in a particular country for a few years and then it steps back. Our projects are time based. So we wanted to make sure that these reforms are sustainable and long lasting. So what we did is we prepared a module on gender-based violence cases and laws for the judicial academies of these countries, including Pakistan. And we also trained a cohort of 20 plus people who can teach these courses and who can train the future judges and prosecutors. And to make sure that this course is mandatorily taught to all incoming judges as well as judges who do refresher courses in these academies. So I think that was a good institutional reform and a good governance model before we left the country. Now on the side, another interesting work that we did is that how do we make sure that general masses in the country, especially the decision makers, base their decisions on law rather than the mindset or the customary or social norms. So we used trucks. Pakistan is very famous for its truck art, and trucks normally carry very comical and funny messages on its back. So we kind of took few trucks and we painted very positive messages and empowering messages on those trucks. For instance, not giving inheritance to your daughters is a crime under this and this section of this and this law. So, so if you're driving behind a truck, you are kind of looking at this message and thinking, oh yeah, giving right to inheritance to my daughter or my sister is important, and if I don't do it, it's illegal. So that's how we really work in this rule of law area. Now, before I end my conversation, I really want to share how a World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index is being used in our work. So it works on 8 factors, but out of those 5 have been very, very useful for us, including the fundamental rights, the constraints on government powers, criminal and legal justice, etc. We use this Rule of Law Index not only to gather information and statistics, but also to convince the governments that it is important for them to work in this area with us, because we have gathered this information from a very credible source of Rule of Law Index of the World Justice Project. So it gives us credibility, authority, with which we go and then talk to our partners in these countries. So thank you, World Justice Project, once again for doing this phenomenal groundwork for us. And thank you once again for inviting me for today's conversation. And with that, I say a very, very good day to all of you. And thank you for listening to me patiently. Bye-bye.